But to kick off our first talk of the session, from Temple University, we're going to have Professor Anshul Rege, Katura Williams, and Rachel Blyman. Matt talked about leveraging attack for insider threat. Professor Rege's team has been putting attack to another unique use with social engineering. Since Anshul and Rachel spoke at ATT&CKcon Power Hour, we've kept in touch, working mostly with my co-MC, Jamie Williams. So I'm really excited for them to share the unique way that they've been using attack in the classroom. So please welcome to the stage, Anshul, Katura, and Rachel. The slider remote, it's the big green arrow.
So hello, everyone. My name is Katura Williams, and I am here on behalf of the CARE Lab to introduce our paper, or our presentation, sorry, I'm in academic mode, exploring how students map social engineering techniques to the attack framework during a real-time cybersecurity exercise. And before I begin, I just want to introduce the lab and ourselves and tell you a little bit about what it is that we do. As I said, I'm Katura, so I'm a graduate student and a graduate research assistant in the CARE Lab. There's Rachel Blyman to my left and Dr. Anshul Rege, the head of the lab, to my right. We are a part of an NSF-funded, woman-led cybersecurity research lab that has a human and socio-behavioral focus. Each of us sort of specializes in something different, but broadly the lab is interested in critical infrastructure, ransomware, surveillance and privacy, social engineering, and cybersecurity education. So I just want to transition into talking about our presentation and give you a quick overview of what social engineering is. Social engineering is defined as any act that influences a person to speak, reveal information, or act in a way that may or may not be in their best interest. In 2017, it was reported that about 70% of US organizations experienced some form of a social engineering attack, and it took around 20 days for those organizations to resolve these incidents. And as we know from the amount of vishing calls we've received about car warranties and the prevalence of ransomware attacks, we know that these social engineering attacks are still happening, and the rate that they're happening has probably increased. The financial loss from these attacks has been total between business email compromise and romance scams and phishing attacks has totaled about $2.23 billion. So given the prevalence of these attacks and how financially costly they are, it's obvious that we need to start focusing on social engineering as a means of addressing cybersecurity. So we know that the human factor is the most leveraged part of cybersecurity attacks, especially through social engineering, but the field has neglected social engineering and is instead focusing very heavily on bolstering technical skills as a means of providing cybersecurity. And while that's great, it leaves a big hole. And we know that there's a upcoming workforce, not an upcoming, but there is a workforce shortage of about 2.7 million cybersecurity professionals. And if the field would just transition to focusing or putting some effort into discussing social engineering and embracing it, you could pull people from different disciplines into cybersecurity, make the field a bit more holistic instead of just centered on technical aspects. And then you could start to fill these gaps in the workforce. So this is where we come in. One of the things that we do is provide social engineering education, both to students and educators. And we do this through live capture the flag social engineering competitions, as well as Dr. Rege implementing course exercises centered around social engineering in her class. And as a part of that, we also have either competition participants or her students map their strategies and their tactics onto the MITRE framework. And so my colleague Rachel is here to introduce one of those social engineering class activities that undergraduate students participated in.
All right, thanks, Katura. So one of the ways that we are trying to get non-technical students to also be involved in cybersecurity is through a course project in an undergraduate criminal justice cybercrime class. And in this class, one of the projects involves groups of students reading a social engineering case study and mapping the adversarial behavior that they find in that case study onto the attack framework. And for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be going over 2 requirements of this course project, and we'll compare some of the results between groups who read the same exact case study. So one of the requirements that the groups had to do for this project was to first identify the tactics, techniques, and sub-techniques that they found in the case study. And for each one that they identified, they had to find a quote from the text as evidence to support their mapping. In the second part of this project, the students had to calculate the proportions of each tactic that were present in the case study. Okay, so in this picture on the bottom here is just one example of one of the group's mappings. You can see that on the left, reconnaissance had a pretty strong mapping, which makes sense to go along with social engineering. But there were mappings from techniques other than reconnaissance as well, and there are some techniques, some tactics that weren't mapped to at all, in this group at least. I also have an example here of one of the quotes that the groups pulled out as evidence to support their mapping to gather victim identity information technique, which is under reconnaissance. And the technique that, or the quote that they pulled out was that Tim, who was the social engineer they were reading about in the case study, went full bore, collecting information such as the email layout scheme, open requests for quotes, all employee names he could find, any social media sites, papers they wrote or published, clubs they were part of, and service providers they used. So this is just one example of being able to prove that the technique was in their case study and to support their mapping. Okay, so now this looks at 3 groups who were each assigned the same case study, and we can see here which tactics were mapped more frequently. So first was reconnaissance. All of the groups had a pretty strong mapping for this tactic, but we also saw some pretty strong mappings for initial access, collection, and exfiltration. Meanwhile, other tactics weren't really mapped to much at all. For example, privilege escalation only had a couple, as well as impact. And it's also interesting, if you look at the bottom where the total row is, you can see that even though all of these groups were reading the same case study, some mapped many more techniques than others. For example, Group A mapped 44 techniques, while Group B only mapped 16. So some groups were much more restricted with what they identified and what they mapped, while others were able to kind of interpret the techniques, which we'll get into in this next slide. So this is leading into our lessons learned from implementing this course project. So the first lesson learned was that there's not really a wrong way to map onto the framework. Each of these groups read the same case study, but they mapped it very differently, and each group was able to provide quotes from the text to support their mapping. And this leads us into our second lesson learned, which was that the tactics and techniques can be interpreted to fit more into a social engineering mindset and social engineering behavior. So for example, one group mapped to the technique of trusted relationship. And while on the attack framework website, the definition is more on the technical side, the quote that this group pulled out was that at this point, a little friendly chit chat ensued, and before you know it, they were laughing and exchanging pleasantries. So this is a way that they were able to interpret this trusted relationship to fit into that social engineering behavior. And the last lesson learned is more of an affirmation that social engineering is relevant to both attack and in cybersecurity. We saw that it was very relevant in the reconnaissance stage, but these social engineering behaviors were mapped throughout, and it's mapped to behavior that is also used in technical attacks. And these technical measures overlap with the social engineering measures in any attack as well. I'm now going to transition it back to Katura. We'll talk a bit more about the competition setting now.
Okay, so in the summer of 2021, the CARE Lab hosted a social engineering CTF competition where teams were essentially hired by us to test the lab and see how good our security was. In total, we had 16 teams, one high school team, 9 undergrads, and 6 grads, and 2 international. 2 of those teams were international. So what they needed to do in the midst of this competition was essentially capture a series of flags, which you can see on the screen. They had to convince us to retweet a tweet from them or try and get some information on our mail client, our office location, get us to alter the web page. And each of these flags had different point values. An additional part of the competition was that they had to put together a formal pen test report. And in that pen test report, they needed to detail both their pretexts and their strategies, but they also needed to develop a playbook where they needed to map the entire strategy onto the MITRE framework. And here we have an example playbook. Under this example, the student was trying to get information, or was trying to get our office phone number. And they impersonated a Microsoft employee and told us that at the end of, like, could they have our phone number in case we got disconnected? So as you can see, they mapped their strategy on here, starting with the OSINT procedure where they needed to gather information from us or information on us, either through searching our Twitters and our emails and our resumes, and then just doing OSINT on the university as a whole. They then transitioned into building their pretext and their persona, establishing a trusting relationship with us, masquerading as the Microsoft employee, establishing an account as a Microsoft employee, and then phishing for the information. And then they ended with asking us for the phone number in case we got disconnected. Again, playing off of that trusted relationship that they had established with us, and that also that Microsoft is a reputable company, so we probably wouldn't question them wanting our phone number in general, and then phishing for that information. And now Dr. Rege is going to talk more about some of those playbooks that we found.
Great. It's a green button.
Yes.
All right, great, thanks. So first off, thanks everyone for coming out. Super excited to be here, and I'm gonna just pick up on the flag that Katora just talked about, which was to disclose, get us to reveal our office location or phone number. So what you're seeing here on the table is the overall, across all the playbooks that we got from all the 16 teams. But we're focusing on 5 teams in particular that we thought did a really good job with their playbooks, because that's something they had to put in their reports, right? Is map out your playbooks. What you don't see in the playbooks are actually the responses that the pushback that we gave them, right? So we just kept it clean and only wanted the student perspective to show up. So for this particular flag, if you look at the last 5 columns, right, we have 2 graduate teams mappings, 2 undergraduate teams mappings, and 1 high school team mapping. And if you pay attention to the bottom half of the table, what you're going to see is predominantly the tactic of reconnaissance, which is not surprising, right? They're trying to get information about us. So a lot of the techniques that you see here, right, gathering victim information, victim org information, the 1591.001, which is exactly the flag itself, right, determine the physical location. So that's not surprising. Right, a lot of this was built into, or the very theme or the essence of the competition. Overall, this is all 16 mappings right now. We found 7 really popular tactics, and this gets very, very interesting. So what doesn't surprise me anyways, right, is we have 43 reconnaissance, obviously is a very popular tactic. We also have resource development, which is sort of setting the stage, and creating pretext and personas with which you're going to come and approach us. What was interesting was 005, right, because that's something that shows up later on in the intrusion chain as a tactic. But we found it being used heavily because of one particular technique that you're going to see in the next slide. But that was the second most popular tactic that was being used. So what was going on there? So these are the 9 most popular techniques now for the competition. So if you look at the first column, T1036, which is masquerading. And this is something that really caught us off guard. I think the definition that is provided for this particular technique in the attack framework is literally about posing as somebody else, right? Creating fake personas, blah, blah, blah. But it's intended to be a defense evasion tactic. We found it being used as pretext persona developments that went hand in hand with the reconnaissance phase, which is why students were using it quite a bit at the beginning. So that was interesting. 1593, 1598, all of those made sense because again they were part of the reconnaissance tactic. But we have some tail end ones here that we thought were very, very interesting as well. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So some of the lessons that we learned, we found, and these are after many chats that I've had with Jamie about this, right, is what's going on, right? Because we're trying to interpret these findings. And we needed expertise to help us figure this out. So one of the things that we found is students were toggling between using 1036, 1585, and 1136, right? And so what I really like about this is it's open to interpretation, right? So students they were essentially doing similar things. Everyone was doing a pretext, everyone was creating a persona, but they use these different techniques to account for that. So, and I should also which I should have done a little earlier, but a lot of these students are not technical, right? Or they've never used attack before. So this was, for many of them, their first introduction to the framework. So we didn't really impose any set rules or give them a detailed sort of study session, if you will, on how to use this framework. We left it open to their creativity and imagination. So we found, like I said, students could mix and match and use these techniques. And sometimes it was the same team that would use masquerading in one sort of, when they were pursuing one flag, but then for another flag, they said it was 1585, right? So that was something that we thought was interesting. In terms of tactics that were used, right? So we saw this a lot with persistence. As I mentioned, when they started pursuing a flag, we didn't just give it to them. There was pushback, right? So, but they persisted. So a lot of them used the TA0003 persistence, but they didn't identify specific techniques within that they used. There were also instances where we saw in their playbooks, right, that they were using tactics and techniques of persistence or other things, but then they never mapped it on, right? So there was that scenario as well. The third point here, no major surprise. The theme of the competition, again, was social engineering. A lot of it was OSINT, reconnaissance, right? All these kinds of stuff. But what was really cool is a lot of the human and socio-behavioral aspects that we're interested in were actually captured pretty well. There were some tactics and techniques that were minimally used. Now, we did have some flags. I think there were two. One of them was trying to, Adam introduced us and he said that we were here last year for the Power Hour. We maintain a ransomware incident data set, a critical infrastructure ransomware incident data set, which is a public resource, by the way. But we set it up as a flag, convince us to give it to you, right? So that's IP. So that they actually covered that with T1005. They were able to get data from our system if we agreed to give them the data set. The last one here, 40 impact, this was data manipulation. So one of the flags was convince us to change content on our actual website, right? And so what we're essentially doing is we have disinformation that's going on our website or misinformation, depending on how you look at it. So there were some teams that were able to successfully get there using pure social engineering, and that's what they then used. So carrying on with this idea of creativity, one of the things that we wanted to do was in the report ask students, well, what recommendations do you have for mitigations? And for a lot of social engineering related mitigations, the attack framework doesn't offer a lot of detail, right? Because that falls kind of outside the scope a little bit. But what we really liked was that students used techniques to guide mitigations, right? So I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can get a feel for, like if you look at the spear phishing one, right? So that was a technique that they said they used in the competition. So they came up with their own sets of recommendations for that. So anti-spoofing, email authentication, and so on and so forth. So again, we gave them that creativity. So one of the last things that we like to say, right, that we are finding very useful is that students can actually use ATT&CK as an aid. Rachel mentioned that there's no right or wrong way to map. I think we agree with that. We want them to get a feel for the framework. And I think this helps them understand the adversarial mindset, right? Because they understand where they are in the intrusion chain. They can also figure out which techniques can help them successfully move from one tactic to the next or not, right? Like what works, what doesn't work, and how might adversaries be doing that themselves. Another interesting point that we found, obviously not all risks and threats are captured in ATT&CK. And I think this is partially because of the reason that some of the harms that I'm thinking of as a social scientist are not necessarily technical or tangible harms per se, but things like reputation loss, right? Or again, we had a talk earlier, wonderful one on insider threats, right? So, how can students use the insider threat TTP knowledge base, for instance, in this particular case? And the last point here is, we hope that this is something that's useful to other educators. Like I said, we're social scientists, and one of the things that we're trying to do is to use well-established frameworks like the ATT&CK framework to show that the social science side of it, the socio-behavioral, psychological aspects, are relevant and they can be mapped onto really well-respected frameworks like the ATT&CK framework. So that's everything that we have for you, and we can open it up to questions or comments. And thank you again, ATT&CKcon, for bringing us here. That's really cool. And thank you all for coming out.
And really, truly honored. Thank you, not just for the great presentation, but what you do to, exactly as you highlighted, very humbly, but I'm gonna, sing the praises here. Extending these great ideas and really asking questions that resonate with all of us, but most importantly, extending that knowledge to everyone, making sure, anyone, underrepresented people, just bring that accessibility, to different groups. Because, looking at those mappings, I had a blast going through their data set because it's just such a different, unique perspective on, something that I thought I really knew. But exactly as you said, the big lessons learned were, there really is no right way to use ATT&CK. It's really what works for you. Like tactics, techniques, and procedures could be almost anything. So really, truly a pleasure and honor. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Question here. Just to repeat for the live audience, a two-part question, very interesting. I'm excited to see the response here. But part one was, we were bringing in students who might not have heard of ATT&CK. We did a quick introduction so they kind of knew where the website was and such. But did you have any kind of impressions or artifacts or any kind of lessons learned from their learning curve, kind of adopting and working with ATT&CK and, from first start to end, what that looked like? And then part two, what about the physical social engineering side? Were there any big lessons learned there regarding lock picking, opening doors, putting a mask on? A really interesting space.
So yeah, sure. Jamie, I'm going to weave you into my response. So heads up. So that's a great question. I'll start with part two. No to physical because this was during the pandemic. One of the things that we found is it's not so much necessarily about pandemic anymore. A lot of universities, colleges, high schools have been hit hard budget-wise. So even this year, we're keeping our competition virtual. So we can't really get at the physical aspect just yet. Now, with regards to part one, a lot of them didn't learn about ATT&CK before. We actually had Jamie come in and do an hour's worth of an orientation so that we could all, become used to it. And the competition was about social engineering, right? And we want to see their playbooks. The attack component was something that we were looking for in terms of consistency, to guide students along. So one of the things that we do have is we have the playbooks from all the students in their reports, right? So we're actually going through those right now. What I know Jamie was saying, it's like, how cool would it have been if we could have done a focus group with them right after and just gone inside their brains and see what was going on. So that's something that we're trying to get at, because for us, we were just trying to do a proof of concept. Can we even do this competition virtually? So now that we've gone through that, that's part of the lessons learned, is how do we now get into the next issue of metrics and measurement? What we do have, at least, are the playbooks, which were mapped onto. And I thought what was really cool is some of the teams even mapped our responses to the attack framework, which I thought was very clever as well. Yeah.
Only thing I'd add to that was the biggest lesson learned I had was that best practice of checking each other mapping. Because I mapped, before we did all this, I mapped their case study to attack. And I was like, oh, I think this makes sense to me. I'm okay with this. And after reviewing the students' work, I was like, they had some really good ideas, like some things I didn't really think about it that way. So, really making sure, even internally, we do that. We spend weeks doing those checks. So, it all comes down to, like you said, that, opening your aperture, getting a little, a bit of diversity on perspectives, and then really making sure, like, what are we, the mappings aren't going to be something we're just going to throw at the problem to be a solution. It's really, that connective glue towards, what the best mapping is, the one that works best for us.
Yeah, and what was really cool, I'll just add with this one thing, is like I said, we had high school teams, undergrad, we had one high school team, an all-girls team from the US Virgin Islands, and they were amazing. They had some of the best playbook mappings compared to even undergrads and grads. So in terms of sort of skill levels or education level or things, that's something else that we're interested in looking at, right? Does that have an impact on students' understandings? So I don't think there's a right age to even start learning about attack. I think high schools can certainly sort of get into that space. And this is part of the workforce training, right? Because if we start talking about it by the time they enter the workforce, they're going to be already at least exposed to it, maybe try their hand at it, and they can hit the ground running. So, yeah.
So I think we're running on time here. But one final comment and thought is, you mentioned, this work, the penetration testing, everything you're doing in the CARE lab, including the ransomware set. So thank you.
Yes.
What's next?
Well, you know what's next. So we're doing our competition again this year. The theme is the CARE lab has been hit with ransomware, which I think is super ironic because we maintain a ransomware data set that is very, very popular. So there's going to be a lot of that. Can I say? Yeah, so he's actually going to be behind the scenes with us, just like he was last year. So he is actually a very, very solid social engineer. Watch out for him. So he's really good. But what I really like about the attack team is that they were so welcoming to this idea of education, and they were patient and they were understanding. That's what we like to see as educators, is more folks at MITRE, right, or in industry come and engage with us, and also not just with technical folks, but also with social scientists. So
thank you so much. It was a pleasure.